Greetings of the day students. Here we are in our BA third year optional English, semester 5th, paper of literary theory and criticism, introduction to criticism. This is section 1, the background of English criticism, and chapter 1st, the Greek masters. Among the Greek masters, here we are going to study Plato today. As we start with Plato, we'll discuss his age and works first. His age, it is considered that his date of birth is 427 BC, but certainly he died in 348 BC. He was one of the most celebrated disciples of Socrates. Among his days, the glory of the Athenian art and literature, illustrated in the artists like Phidias and Polygnotus, and writers like Achilles, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, was on the wane. The place of art and literature was taken by philosophy and oratory. The philosophers like Parmenides, Empedocles, and Socrates were greatly hailed, and the orators like Gorgias, Antiphon, and Lysias also were famous in that age. Now, Socrates hates them all by his dispassionate quest for truth. He challenged many unestablished beliefs and conventions. The value of literature to society and its nature and functions were most considered. Previous age was one of creative activity, and the 4th century BC was an age of critical inquiry and analysis. Now we'll start with Plato, the professed man of critical thinking. Plato was not a professed critic of literature, and his critical observations are not embodied in any single work, but Plato's chief interest was philosophical investigation, which forms the subject of his great work, the Dialogues. It's so because each question that interested Plato is discussed there in question and answer form by a number of interlocutors, the chief of whom is Socrates. It's Socrates who utters those profound truths that form the philosophical system of Plato. Now we'll discuss the important works of Plato. The important works penned by Plato are Ion, Cratylus, Protagoras, Gorgias, Symposium, Republic, Phaedrus, Philebus, Laws. Now, the next important thing that we are going to discuss is obviously Plato's view of art, and his view of art is intimately bound up with his theory of ideas. Plato says in the Republic that ideas are ultimate reality. As we know, things are conceived as ideas before they take practical shape as things. For example, the example of a tree. The idea of everything is therefore its original pattern, and the thing itself its copy. As the copy ever falls short of the original, it is once removed from reality. Art, literature, painting, sculpture reproduces but things as mere pastime. The first in words, that is literature, expresses art in words. The next, painting, expresses art in colors, and the sculpture expresses art in stone. So, all art form, according to Plato, is merely a copy, as it merely copies a copy. And as it merely copies a copy, it is twice removed from reality. things themselves being imperfect copies of the ideas from which they spring, their reproductions in art must be more imperfect still, according to Plato. They take men away from reality rather than towards it. At best, they are but partial images of it. And this is the ground of Plato, that Plato attacks poetry. Plato's attack on poetry. Plato's concern for the good of the individual and the state marks his pronouncements on poetry. Judging by these twin standards, he finds more in it to condemn than to approve. He explains the incapacity of poetry as an art form to get to the root of the things, being concerned with only a semblance of them twice removed from reality, is the first ground of his condemnation of poetry. Now we will discuss the other grounds of condemnation of poetry as propounded by Plato. The important one, the first one, is poetic inspiration. The poet writes not because he has thought long over what he has to say, but because he is inspired. And the muse suddenly fills him and makes him sing. And it is sure that such a sudden outpouring of the soul cannot be a reliable substitute for truth based on reason, according to Plato. The poet's utterances contain a profound truth, but this appears only when they have been subjected to a further test, the test of reason. By themselves, they are not safe guides, and so poetry cannot take the place of philosophy, according to Plato. So, the first ground of condemnation of poetry, according to Plato, is the poetic inspiration. The second ground of condemnation of poetry, according to Plato, happens to be the emotional appeal of poetry. Being the product of inspiration, it affects the emotions rather than reason. And emotions being just impulses of the moment, like the poetic inspiration mentioned just before, emotions also cannot be such safe guides as reason, which considers everything coolly before itself to move in any direction. Only a few, Plato complains in his Republic, can realize the baneful effects of this. For if we let our own sense of pity grow strong by feeding upon the grief of others, it is not easy to restrain it in the case of own sufferings. So, this is the second ground of condemnation of poetry, according to Plato. The third important ground of condemnation of poetry, as discussed by Plato, is the non-moral character of poetry. So, finally, Plato indicts poetry for its lack of concern with morality. In its treatment of life, it treats both virtue and vice alike, sometimes making the one and sometimes the other triumph indifferently without regard for moral considerations. It pained Plato to see virtue often coming to grief in the literature esteemed in his days. For example, the epics of Homer, the narrative verse of Hesiod, the odes of Pindar, and the tragedies of Achilles, Sophocles, and Euripides. Plato explains it in his Republic with his quote, I quote, "They give us to understand that many evil livers are happy and many righteous men unhappy, and that wrongdoing, if it be undetected, is profitable, while honest dealing is beneficial to one's neighbor, but damaging to one's self." Unquote. Gods as unjust or revengeful are guilty of other vices. So poetry presents gods as unjust or revengeful or guilty of other vices. It also represents the heroes under the sway of uncontrollable passion of all kinds, like pride, anger, grief, and so on. The portraits of gods and heroes are equally objectionable because both are represented in the most unfavorable light. How? For example, gods are displayed as unjust or revengeful or guilty of other vices. Heroes are shown under the sway of uncontrollable passions of all kinds, such as pride, anger, grief, and so on. So, such literature corrupted both the citizen and the state according to Plato. Now, these are the three important grounds of condemnation of poetry as have been propounded by Plato. The next thing that we are going to discuss here is the functions of poetry. So, as we know, Plato's theory of ideas is wholly and solely based upon his concern for the ideal citizen and the ideal state. So, according to him, a poet is a good artist only in so far as he is a good teacher. His quote from the Republic explains this very well. I quote, "We must look for artists who are able out of the goodness of their own natures to trace the nature of beauty and perfection. That so, our young men, like persons who live in a healthy place, may be perpetually influenced for good," unquote. Poetic truth must be the highest truth, ideal forms of justice, goodness, beauty, and the like.